Carlos Martinez, a 32-year-old police officer, felt he was at a crossroads in his life. Recently, he had been spending his days with a new girlfriend, a lively and gentle young woman who had turned his world upside down. Though they'd only been together for 2 weeks, a rare chemistry bonded them. Carlos, usually cautious in love, was already surprised to find himself dreaming of a future with her, imagining moments of closeness, shared laughter, and even a family. For the first time in a long while, his heart carried the imprint of a deep desire for stability, a need to build something real and lasting. That evening, Carlos was on a night patrol with his usual partner, Marco. They were slowly driving down a quiet alley, where the shadows of buildings seemed to stretch endlessly, almost swallowed by the heavy silence of the sleeping city. Their exchanges were few, each lost in their thoughts, lulled by the gentle monotony of the nightly routine. Carlos thought of her, of their next date, and of that strange, exciting feeling that made him suddenly so vulnerable. The silence of the night enveloped them, almost soothing, when a sharp sound shattered the stillness. A cry. A baby crying. Carlos froze, his muscles tensed like a bow, all his senses alert. He held his breath, his heart pounding faster with each passing second, as the cry resumed, this time sharper, more desperate, cutting through the cold, still night air. He exchanged a brief glance with Marco, who nodded silently, understanding the urgency of the situation. Without wasting a moment, Carlos sprang into action, guided by the piercing sound that seemed to amplify the weight of every second. His steps led him to a row of trash bins lined against a brick wall, their dark shapes half hidden by the shadows cast by the dim streetlight nearby. He scanned the dimness, every noise seeming more intense, until his eyes finally rested on a small cardboard box thrown amidst the garbage. His throat tightened as he saw its contents, a tiny red, wrinkled face, eyes closed, crying bitterly. The baby's features were marked by fatigue and fear, its cheeks damp, reddened by the cold, and its small arms trembling with desperate shivers. Without thinking, Carlos leaned down, his police instincts giving way to a protective, almost visceral impulse. He plunged his hands into the box, gently lifting the baby, feeling the feverish warmth and fragility of its small body. As he held the infant close, he noticed the unreal softness of its skin and the lightness of its tiny fingers, weakly gripping his uniform. He tightened his embrace, determined to offer it a sense of security, to fulfill the need to be protected that shone through each of its cries. The baby, still shaking with sobs, seemed comforted by the warmth of his arms. Carlos murmured softly, his voice more tender than he'd ever heard it before. "It's okay now, little one. I'm here." His words floated in the air, almost reassuring, as he rocked the infant to calm its distress. Each movement was filled with gentleness and care, as if he feared breaking this small life in his hands. In that suspended moment, Carlos felt a mix of emotions he couldn't explain. This abandoned baby, so vulnerable, stirred feelings of compassion and responsibility in him that he had never felt so intensely. A protective, almost paternal need rooted itself within him as he looked at this little being who now depended on him. The seconds seemed to stretch endlessly as he continued to rock the baby, feeling the softness of its uneven breath and the fragile weight of its tiny body against his chest. His thoughts raced, each question arising with an almost painful intensity. Who could abandon such an innocent being? What circumstances, what pain, would drive someone to such an act? Confusion and anger boiled within him, but he pushed those feelings aside to focus on the present moment, on the urgent need to protect this baby. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the slight tremor in his hands, and pulled out his phone. His voice was low, almost trembling, as he called for help. "This is Officer Carlos Martinez. I've found a baby in a trash bin. She's alive, but she has a fever. I need an ambulance at the corner of 5th and Olmos, immediately." A silence followed his statement, interrupted only by the softer cries of the infant, which were gradually calming. A firm and reassuring voice answered on the other end. "Officer Martinez, the ambulance is on its way. Please stay with the baby until they arrive." Carlos stayed there, holding the child against him, rocking her with infinite tenderness. Their breaths seemed to harmonize, as if, despite the shadow and cold of the alley, A different world was settling around them. He could feel the light shudders of her breath, still interrupted by sobs, but the little one was calming, gazing up at him with wide, dark, damp eyes. Those eyes, filled with a fragile, silent gleam, seemed to search his own, seeking refuge, a promise of comfort. A bond was forming, something deep and irrevocable, a tacit commitment that resonated beyond mere compassion. Holding her like this, Carlos understood that he was taking on a silent responsibility, a vow of protection for this vulnerable being. He felt the tender warmth of her small body against his own, and, in an instinctive gesture, he tightened his embrace slightly, as if sealing the moment. Childhood memories flooded back, simple moments filled with love, his mother rocking him, the gentle words she whispered to him, the reassuring scent of her presence. A wave of nostalgia washed over him, and he was filled with a tenderness he hadn't felt in years. Life was sending him a sign, an opportunity to reconnect with that part of himself he thought was gone. This little girl, lost and defenseless, reminded him that he was not just a witness to tragedy and violence, but that he could also embody gentleness, be a shelter in the storm. He understood in that moment that his growing attachment was no mere coincidence. It was as though fate had placed this baby in his path to awaken him to another dimension of himself, to remind him that he could be more than just a mere observer of the world's chaos, but also a protector of innocence. He found himself smiling at her, whispering words of comfort that he rarely heard in his daily life as a police officer, where the harshness of the streets often left little room for tenderness. As he rocked her, Carlos felt a new determination welling up within him. This little girl, through her mere presence, awakened an inner strength, a resolve to fight against injustice in a way he had never considered before. She represented an innocence he promised to defend, a fragile purity he would protect to the best of his ability, even if it went far beyond what was expected of him as a police officer. The sound of sirens grew louder, intensifying as the ambulance approached. Yet, for Carlos, the world around him seemed to fade away, leaving only this suspended moment. There were no more dark alleys, no more cold night, just him and this little girl who nestled against him, her tiny fingers weakly gripping one of his, as if, despite her fragile state, she understood she could count on him, that he was there for her. This simple contact, this small hand holding on to his with surprising strength, stirred in Carlos a feeling that went beyond mere compassion. It was like an anchor, an invisible but powerful thread now binding them together. And, for the first time, he knew with certainty that this moment would change his life far more than he could have ever imagined. The sirens grew nearer, and soon, a red and blue light illuminated the alley. His colleagues arrived, the radio crackling, and the bustle of an intervention began to form around him. But Carlos remained focused on the baby, holding her tightly while softly whispering reassuring words. A nurse approached to offer to take the baby from his arms, but Carlos hesitated for a moment, feeling a strange reluctance to hand her over. "Don't worry, we'll take good care of her," the nurse whispered, soft and understanding, sensing his sudden attachment. Finally, Carlos carefully placed the little one into her arms, the child's fingers gently slipping from his. He watched her be placed into the ambulance, the doors closing as if to seal away this moment that felt unreal. But inside him, something deep had been born, something he could no longer ignore. Once the ambulance left, Carlos hurried to his car to follow it, his heart still racing from the intense emotions he had just experienced. The image of the tiny face, the wide eyes filled with tears and fear, remained etched in his mind, and the thought of leaving her alone in an unfamiliar environment was unbearable. The alley, the trash can, everything seemed distant and unreal, but that little life, that piercing cry, stayed with him. At the hospital, after the initial exams and emergency care, he sat in the waiting room, a place where time seemed to stretch on endlessly. The walls, white and sterile, seemed saturated with anxiety and hushed voices, and every minute felt like an eternity. The ticking of a clock echoed like a misaligned heartbeat, while the rapid movements of medical staff added a palpable frenzy to the air. Despite the flurry of activity around him, Carlos remained still, frozen in the waiting, his mind consumed by troubled thoughts. He relived every detail of the moment he had found the little one, imagining the reasons behind her abandonment, wondering how a mother could inflict such pain. The fear of losing her before he had even truly known her paralyzed him. The minutes continued to tick by, and he felt the worry shift into a deep, silent anxiety, mingling with a growing determination. Finally, a nurse came to see him, her face full of kindness and compassion. "She's fine, officer. She was dehydrated, and her fever has stabilized. She's resting now, and she's safe," she said with a soothing smile. The words rang like a life-saving melody in Carlos' mind, but despite the reassuring news, he couldn't bring himself to move. He stayed, asking for permission to see her, even if just for a few minutes. The nurse, touched by his insistence, eventually agreed. She led him to the small room where the baby lay sleeping, peaceful under the soft lighting. Upon seeing her, a mixture of relief and unconditional love flooded over him, and his heart tightened once more. He approached the crib gently, watching the little one, so fragile yet now calm, breathing softly. He noticed the rhythm of her heartbeat through the thin blanket, each pulse symbolizing a precious and unique life. He remained there, sitting in the chair next to her, watching her sleep. A sense of peace washed over him, mixed with a renewed determination. That night, Carlos didn't leave the hospital. He stayed by her side, taking it upon himself to be present, offering a silent vigil of protection. Every breath she took, every slight movement, reassured him and strengthened the invisible bond that had formed between them. Hours passed, and fatigue began to take hold of him, his eyelids growing heavier as he fought to stay awake. The harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital, usually so cold and impersonal, now seemed softer in his eyes, almost comforting. But as he closed his eyes for a moment, seeking respite from the drowsiness, he found himself dreaming of a future where this little life would play a central role. In his mind, images began to form, vivid with color and emotion. A future where he could offer her protection and love, a future where he would not just be a police officer, burdened with the weight of tragic stories, but a father, or at least a protector, a caring guide in a world that was often hostile. He envisioned himself accompanying her on her first steps, laughing at her clumsy attempts, wiping away her tears, and celebrating her victories. Deep down, he knew this encounter had changed the course of his life. The sirens, the emergencies, and the chaos of his profession gradually faded away, giving way to a new hope, a new mission. He imagined sunny days spent playing in the park, flying a kite, or telling bedtime stories. The very idea of building a life, of passing on values, lessons and dreams, filled him with an unexpected warmth. But as these visions became clearer, reality reminded him with a persistent, quiet insistence. He knew that this dream would be difficult to realize. This little girl, although she had become the center of his attention, was a stranger in a complex world. Who would search for her? Who would ensure she had a loving home? Thoughts swirled in his mind, but he refused to let doubt take hold. He sat up in his chair, determined. Instead of fleeing from reality, he wanted to face it. Carlos stood up and approached the crib, looking at the child's peaceful face. He began to whisper promises softly, as if she could hear every word. "I will never let you down. I will do everything in my power to protect you," he said with conviction, his voice trembling slightly under the weight of emotion. In that moment, he understood that his professional and personal life had never been so intertwined. This was not just a matter of duty or responsibility. It was a matter of choice, of dedication. This little girl, who had meant so little in the eyes of the world, was becoming the light that would guide his path. The hours continued to pass, but for Carlos, each minute now felt like a precious moment. He wasn't merely watching over her, he was committing to becoming a better man. He already imagined defending her, advocating for her if she ever needed help. His heart beat with the rhythm of a new determination, a silent promise to fully invest in this new life that was slowly unfolding before him. Then, as he gazed at the child's peaceful face, an idea, as sudden as it was obvious, struck him. He decided to adopt her. This choice, though bold, seemed like the only possible path. This little girl deserved a home, unconditional love, and he was ready to sacrifice everything to give her that. The thought of welcoming her into his life, giving her a name, an identity, ignited a new energy within him. Adopting the baby had become his goal, a mission that resonated deeply with his desire to protect. He knew it wouldn't be easy. The adoption process, often long and complicated, would be filled with obstacles. But for the first time, these challenges seemed insignificant in light of the love he already felt for her. The formalities, the bureaucratic questions, all of that could be overcome because this growing bond surpassed everything else. As he imagined their future together, he saw himself building a home, filling the walls with laughter and love. Scenes of playtime in the living room, animated dinners around the table, evening conversations before bedtime began to shine in his mind like a bright picture. This little girl, with her gentleness and innocence, had become the center of his universe. Carlos sat back in the chair next to the crib, his thoughts swirling around this new life project. He began to consider the steps he would need to take, the conversations he would need to have with his superior, and the paperwork he would need to fill out. It would require patience, determination, and unwavering will. But he was ready for anything. In that moment, as he watched her, he felt a wave of gratitude for this unexpected encounter. This baby had opened his eyes to what he could be. She had shown him that, beyond his role as a police officer, he could take on the role of a father. He whispered to the sleeping child, "You will never be alone. I promise to give you all the love and protection you deserve. I will fight for you." The words came from his mouth like a sacred promise. He already felt the responsibility and the honor of being her protector, her father. In that moment, he knew that no matter the obstacles he would face on his path, he would not back down from anything to make this dream a reality. The bond that connected them grew stronger, and each beat of his heart echoed with the hope of a future filled with love, laughter, and shared happiness.